There are things a man carries that never show up in the ledger. I kept a ledger most of my life: cattle bought, cattle lost, hands hired, the price of nails in a bad year. And somewhere in all those columns of careful numbers, there's not one line for the winter I'm about to tell you about. No line for the storm. No line for the stranger. No line for what the two of us did to keep from dying, which to this day I have never said out loud to a living soul. I'm telling it now because I am old, and old men either talk or they rot, and I have never been any good at rotting. So if you've got the patience for a slow story told by a slow man, sit close. I'll start where the cold started, right in the middle of it, the way the cold always comes, not knocking, not asking, just suddenly there, like it had been in the room the whole time and only now decided to let you feel it. The mare went down at the bottom of the draw, and I knew before I hit the snow that she'd broken something. I heard it more than felt it, a sound like a dry branch snapping under a wagon wheel, muffled, wrong, coming up through the saddle and into the seat of my pants in the half-second before the whole world tilted. Then I was off her and into the drift, mouth full of white, the wind taking my hat the way a thief takes a purse, quick and without apology, and gone. I lay there a moment counting myself. That's a habit you get, working alone in country that doesn't care whether you live. You hit the ground, and before you do anything else you take inventory. Arms too, working. Legs too, both screaming, both mine. Head ringing but attached. I have always had the sort of mind that makes lists when it ought to be praying, and I made one then, lying in snow that was already trying to crawl in past my collar. The mare was screaming. I want to be honest about that, because people who tell these stories like to skip the ugly parts, and I have never trusted a clean story. She was a good horse named Juniper, 11 years old, and she had carried me through more weather than most men see in a lifetime. And she was lying on her side in the bottom of that draw with her near foreleg bent at an angle God never drew, and she was screaming in a way that I felt in my teeth. I did what you do. I won't describe it. I'll only say that I had one cartridge left in the carbine that I hadn't soaked through, and I used it, and afterward the silence was so complete and so sudden that I thought for one swimming moment that the shot had deafened me. It hadn't. It was just the snow. Snow eats sound. That's the first thing the high country teaches you, and the last thing you forget, that a blizzard is not loud the way people think. A blizzard is quiet. It is the quietest thing there is. It muffles the world like a hand over your mouth. And somewhere in that quiet is the temptation to lie down and let it. I was 44 years old that winter, and I had a ranch 2 days' ride behind me and a brother-in-law's funeral 1 day's ride ahead, and between the two of them, nothing. No cabin. No line shack closer than half a day on a good horse, and I no longer had a horse of any kind. I stood up out of the drift, and I started walking, because the only other choice was the one the snow was offering, and I have always been too stubborn to take a gift from anything that wanted me dead. You want to know what cold is? Real cold. Not the cold of stepping out for the paper, not the cold of a drafty kitchen. Real cold is a thing with intentions. By the second hour the wind had found every seam in my coat the way water finds every crack in a roof. My fingers had stopped hurting, which I knew was the worst news they could give me. A finger that hurts is a finger still fighting. A finger gone quiet has surrendered, and the rest of you isn't far behind. I kept them moving inside my gloves, working them, talking to them under my breath like a fool talks to a dog. Come on now. Don't you quit on me. You quit on me and I'll cut you off myself just for spite. I have already told you I'm the kind of man who makes lists instead of praying. I am also the kind who threatens his own hands. Take from that what you will about my character. I won't argue. The light went the way it goes up there. Not down exactly, but gray, the whole world dimming evenly like a lamp turned low by a careful hand, until there was no sun and no shadow and no telling which way was west. I had been keeping the wind on my right cheek to hold a line. Then the wind shifted, the way it does to kill you, and I understood with a clean and terrible calm that I no longer knew which direction was which. That is the moment, if you ever wondered, when a man stops being clever. I had been making my lists. I had been threatening my fingers. I had been telling myself I'd done harder things, which was a lie, but a useful one. And then the wind turned and took my last reference point, and I just stopped. Stood there in the howling quiet with my arms wrapped around myself like a child. And for the first time in my grown life, I felt the bottom of my own courage, and it was closer to the top than I'd ever have believed. I think I might have lain down then. I am not proud of it, but I think I might have. And that is exactly when I smelled smoke. Now, you have to understand what smoke means to a man in that situation. It is the smell of another human being. It is the smell of fire, which means warmth, which means living through the night, a thing that 30 seconds earlier had stopped seeming likely. I turned my whole body into it like a sunflower turning, and I lost it, and I found it again, and I followed my nose into the wind with my dead hands out in front of me like a blind man feeling for a wall. It led me to a cut bank. There was a place where the draw I'd been following undercut itself, where some old flood had carved a hollow back under an overhang of frozen earth and root. And in that hollow, sheltered from the worst of the wind, somebody had built a fire. And beside the fire was a man. I stopped at the edge of the firelight. I want to be exact about this part because it mattered. What happened in those first few seconds, it mattered more than I knew at the time. He was an Apache. I knew it the way you know things in that country, by the cut of his moccasins, knee-high and folded, by his hair, long and tied back with a strip of cloth, by the way he came up off the ground when he saw me, not slow and stiff like a white man surprised, but all at once fluid, a knife already in his hand, though I never saw him reach for it. And I will tell you the truth, because I promised you the truth, and the truth is the only thing I've got left worth giving. In the year 1878 in that country, a white man and an Apache who came upon each other in the dark were not two travelers sharing a road. We were the two ends of a war. There was blood on both sides of it, and not a family I knew of, red or white, that hadn't buried somebody on account of the other. I had ridden with men who'd done things I won't repeat. He had likely seen things done to his that he would carry to his grave. We knew all of this about each other in the first half second, before a word, the way two dogs know it. He stood there with the knife low and ready and the firelight jumping on his face. He was younger than me, maybe 30, with a face like something carved out of the same frozen bank he'd dug his fire under, flat plains, deep-set eyes, a long old scar pulling at the corner of his mouth, so that even at rest he looked like he was almost about to say something bitter. I had no gun. I'd fired my last shell into Juniper. He didn't know that. I could have bluffed. I could have, I suppose, charged him or run or done any of the stupid things a cornered animal does. Instead, I did the only thing my frozen, exhausted, finished body had left in it. I held up my two dead hands so he could see them empty, and I said, in a voice that came out smaller than I meant it to, "I'm not going to make it through the night out there, and neither one of us is going to make it being scared of the other one." He didn't understand the words. I knew that even as I said them. But a voice carries more than its words. A dog knows the difference between good boy and get out without speaking a syllable of English, and I think what he heard in mine was that I had nothing left. No threat in it. No fight. Just a man at the end of himself, standing in the snow, asking. He looked at me a long time. The fire popped. The wind screamed up above the cut bank, way up over our heads, and down here in the hollow it was almost still. Then he did a thing I have turned over in my mind for 50 years and never finished understanding. He didn't put the knife away. He kept it, but he stepped back, one step, and with his other hand slow. He pointed at the far side of the fire from where he stood, at a place on the ground. A place for me to sit. I have known generous men. My own father gave away more than he ever kept and died poor and content because of it. I have seen women share their last in a hungry winter, and men split a final plug of tobacco 3 ways without being asked. I have never, before or since, seen generosity cost a man what it cost that one to point at the ground beside his fire. Because understand, I was the enemy. Everything in his history and his blood and his good sense told him that the kindest thing he could do to a white man who stumbled out of the dark was to kill him before the white man killed him. That was the math of that country. That was survival. And he set the math aside. He chose, in the space of one breath, to gamble his own life on the chance that I meant what my voice said. I crossed to the far side and I sat, slow, keeping my hands where he could see them. We faced each other across that little fire like two men across a card table with everything in the pot, and for a long while neither one of us said anything, because there was nothing to say in any language we shared. I'll tell you what I noticed, sitting there, because the noticing is what saved me from thinking too hard about how close I'd come to dying. I noticed his fire was a small one, smaller than I'd have built. A white man builds a fire to announce himself big, roaring, proud. He'd built his to hide low, banked, throwing just enough heat to live by and just enough light to see by and not one flicker more. A fire built by a man who'd spent his whole life being hunted, who'd learned that a fire is a thing that can save you and a thing that can betray you, often in the same night. I noticed he was hurt. He held his left arm against his body the way you do when moving it costs you. Later I'd see the wound, a long furrow along the ribs, going bad, the skin around it tight and shining and the wrong color. A bullet had grazed him days before, I'd guess, and out here in this, with no doctor and no comfort, it had begun to turn. And I noticed that his teeth were chattering, that for all his stillness and all his strength and all the terrible competence of the man, the cold had its hand on him too. The wound had weakened him. The cold was finishing what the bullet started. His fire was small because he was too hurt to gather more wood, and he was too proud or too cautious to leave it to try. He was, in the plainest terms, in worse shape than I was. He had shelter and fire and I had neither, but he had a hole in his side going septic and a body burning its last reserves trying to fight two enemies at once, the cold without and the rot within. I had only the cold. We were both going to die in that hollow. Unless... I want to slow down here because this is the part of the story where a younger man telling it would skip to the action. But the action wasn't the important thing. The important thing was the deciding, and the deciding took place in silence, in the firelight, between two men who couldn't speak a word to each other. It started with the wood. His fire was guttering. I could see the small pile he'd gathered, and I could see it wouldn't last the hour, and I could see that he knew it too, and that there was nothing he could do about it, because every time he shifted his weight, a flicker of pain crossed that scarred face and his arm clamped tighter to his ribs. So I got up. He came up with me fast, the knife back in his hand, his eyes gone hard. And I understood. A man who stands up sudden in the dark is a man who might be about to do something. I stood very still and I showed him my empty hands again, and then slow, the slowest I have ever moved, I pointed at the dying fire. And then I pointed up the draw, out into the dark where I knew there'd be deadfall under the snow, brush, and broken cottonwood, the bones of old floods. And then I pointed at myself. I'll get wood, I'll come back. He didn't believe me. Why would he? I was a white man telling him I'd walk out into a killing storm and return, to a fire I could just as easily abandon him to die beside. The smart play, the expected play, was for me to take the chance to slip off into the dark and leave him, or worse, to come back with a club instead of kindling. He looked at me with those deep-set eyes and I looked back, and I'll tell you, I have been believed by people in my life and I have been doubted, and there is no lonelier feeling on earth than being doubted when you are telling the truth and have no way to prove it. So I did the only thing I could. I took off my coat. It was the last thing of value I had. It was the only thing standing between me and the cold, and I shrugged it off and I dropped it on the ground by his side of the fire, next to him, where he could keep it. A hostage, I was telling him. I'm leaving you the one thing I can't live without. I have to come back. I can't live without it. You understand? I have to come back. He understood. I saw it move across his face, saw the suspicion break up like ice going out on a river in spring, slow and then all at once. He looked at the coat. He looked at me, standing there in my shirt sleeves in weather that could kill a man in 20 minutes. And something happened in his eyes that I can only call recognition, the way you recognize a thing you felt yourself. He knew what it was to gamble your survival on another person. He'd done it the moment he pointed at the ground. Now I was doing it back. He gave me a single nod, small, just the chin. And then this is the part. He reached down and he picked up my coat, and instead of keeping it for himself the way the cold and his good sense must have screamed at him too, he held it out. To me. He pointed at the dark and at the coat and at me, and the meaning was so plain it didn't need a word in any language. You'll die out there without it, you fool. Take it, get the wood, come back. He gave me back my hostage. He gave me back the very thing I'd left to prove I'd return, which meant he had decided, somewhere in that hard, hunted, dying body, to simply trust me, to let me go warm into the dark with no guarantee at all, on nothing but the sound of a voice and the look of 2 empty hands. I have done business with bankers and preachers and honest men. Nobody ever extended me credit like that. I took the coat, I put it on. My eyes were stinging and I told myself it was the smoke. Then I climbed up out of the hollow into the screaming dark to find wood for the both of us, and as the wind hit me full and took my breath, I understood that I was no longer walking to save my own life. I was walking back to somebody. And that, it turned out, makes all the difference. A man walking to save himself can lie down. A man walking back to somebody waiting cannot. I have thought about that more than almost anything else in my long life, that the surest way to keep a man alive is to make him responsible for someone else. The cold can have your courage. It can have your fingers and your feet and the bottom of your nerve. But it cannot, somehow, have the part of you that has promised to come back. I found the deadfall by feel. I broke my nails on it and didn't notice. I gathered what I could carry, an armload of frozen brush and one good broken limb of cottonwood as long as my leg, and I turned around with the wind at my back now, pushing me, almost kind, and I followed the faint orange smudge of his little hidden fire back down into the hollow. He was where I'd left him. He'd known I would be back the way I'd known he wouldn't run, which is to say, not at all on faith, against all the evidence of the world we'd both grown up in. When he saw me come over the lip of the cut bank with my arms full of wood, something moved across his face that I had not expected and was not prepared for, and that I have never once managed to forget in all the years since. The man smiled. It pulled that old scar tight at the corner of his mouth, and it broke up his whole carved stone face into something young and surprised and glad. And it was, I think, the most purely human thing I had ever seen, that an Apache and a cattleman, 2 ends of a war, sat down to die in the same hole in the ground, and instead found in the worst night of both their lives a reason to be glad of each other. I dumped the wood by the fire. He fed it in, careful, the way he did everything, building the heat up slow. And the little hollow under the cut bank began, for the first time, to feel almost warm. But I want to be honest, the way I promised. We were not saved, not by a long shot. The wood would help. The fire would help. But he was still dying of that wound, and I was still soaked through to the bone, and the storm above us was not finished. It was, in fact, just then deciding to truly begin. The worst of that night was still ahead of us. And the thing we did to survive it, the unusual way, as it were, that 2 enemies found to keep from freezing to death in the dark, is the part I have never told anyone. It's the part I'll tell you next. The storm came down on us about an hour after I got back with the wood, and it came down the way the truly bad ones do, not as a gust, not as a squall, but as a decision. The wind that had been screaming up over the lip of the cut bank stopped screaming. It dropped. And in its place came the snow, thick as wet wool, falling so heavy and so straight that even down in our hollow it began to fill the air, sifting in past the overhang, settling on my shoulders and his, and on the wood we hadn't burned yet. I have ranched 50 years, and I will tell you there is nothing on God's earth that makes a man feel his own smallness like a heavy snow falling in dead still air. The screaming kind you can fight. You can lean into a wind and curse it and feel at least that you and the weather are in some kind of argument. But the silent kind doesn't argue. It doesn't even notice you. It just comes down, patient and enormous, filling the world up inch by inch like water filling a grave. And you understand that it would fall exactly the same way whether you were there to feel it or not. I huddled by the fire and I made a list because that is what I do. Things between me and dying. One small fire. One armload of wood, maybe 2 hours of it. One coat soaked at the shoulders now and freezing. One herd Apache who couldn't gather wood, and one whole cattleman who could but didn't know this country and would lose the fire if he went too far in this. 2 men. One bad situation getting worse. It was not a long list. That's the trouble with lists. The honest ones are always too short. He was getting worse. I could see it even across the little fire. The shivering had stopped, and I knew enough to know that was the wrong direction, that a body stops shivering not because it's warm but because it's run out of the strength to shiver, which is a different and far worse thing. His eyes had gone glassy. The smile he'd given me when I came back over the bank with the wood, that one bright human flash, had closed back up, and his face had taken on a slackness, a heaviness, the look of a man whose fire was burning down on the inside, same as the one in front of him. It was the wound doing it. The cold was just helping. I'd seen wounds go bad before. We all had in that country. A man cuts himself on barbed wire or takes a goring or stops a bullet, and if he's lucky it heals clean, and if he's not, it turns, and you can smell it turn. A sweetish, rotten smell underneath the wood smoke that I caught now and wished I hadn't, because once you know that smell you can never unknow it, and it never means anything good. I pointed at his side, at the arm he kept clamped over his ribs. He looked at me a long moment. Then, slowly, with the deliberate care of a man who has decided something, he took the arm away. The wound ran along his lower ribs, a furrow as long as my hand where a bullet had plowed through the meat without quite going in. It should have been the kind of thing a strong man shrugs off. But it hadn't been cleaned, and it hadn't been closed, and days of cold and dirt and hard travel had done their work. And now the flesh around it was swollen tight and shining and streaked with red lines reaching up toward his chest like the roots of something climbing. I am not a doctor. I want to be plain about that. I have set a few bones and dug out a few bits of lead and sewn up more cuts on horses than on men, and that is the whole of my education. But every cattleman knows one thing about a wound gone like that one had gone, and it is an ugly thing, and it is true. You have to open it. You have to open it and clean it out and let the badness drain, and it is going to hurt the man worse than the bullet did. And there is a fair chance it won't be enough, and there is no chance at all if you leave it closed. I had a knife, not mine. I'd lost mine somewhere in the snow with the mare, but I made him understand, with gestures and a kind of grim pantomime that I'm glad no one was there to witness, that I needed his. The one he'd held on me when I first walked out of the dark. Think about what I was asking. I was asking the man to hand me his only weapon, and then to lie still and let me cut into him with it. He understood. I watched him understand. I watched him do the arithmetic that I'd already done, that he was dying, that the wound was the reason, that I was the only other pair of hands within a day's ride, and that the alternative to trusting me was simply to lie down by the fire and let it have him. He held the knife out, handle first. And then he did a thing that I think about whenever I hear a man called a coward, whenever I hear the word savage used the way men used it then, careless, like it meant something. He took a strip of leather from somewhere in his clothes, a thong, the kind you'd use to mend tack, and he folded it twice, and he put it between his own teeth, and he lay back on the cold ground and he looked up at me and nodded. He prepared himself. He knew exactly what was coming, and he set himself to bear it without a sound, because a sound carries, and a sound in that country could draw the wrong ears even in a storm, and a lifetime of being hunted had taught him that even his own pain was a thing he could not afford to spend loudly. I have never in my life been trusted like that, not by my wife on our wedding night, not by my children, not by any man I ever shook hands with. To put a knife in the hand of your enemy and bare your body to it and bite down and nod, there is no word in my language for what that is. I have looked. There isn't one. I won't tell you all of it. Some things a man should keep, even from a story he's decided to finally tell. I'll tell you that I heated the blade in the fire first, because that much I knew. I'll tell you that I had nothing to clean the wound with but melted snow and the inside of my own shirt, which was the cleanest cloth between us. I'll tell you that I worked as fast as I could make my half-frozen, clumsy fingers go, and that it was not fast enough, and that it was the worst work I have ever done with my hands. And I will tell you that he did not make a sound. His whole body shook. The cord stood out in his neck like rope. Tears ran sideways off his face and froze in his hair. Once his hand shot out and gripped my wrist so hard I felt the bones grind. And then, by main force, by a stubbornness I have never seen the equal of, he made himself let go. Because he understood I needed both my hands, and he put his own hand flat on the cold ground instead and pressed it there, and dug his fingers into the frozen dirt until they bled, rather than risk spoiling the work. That is stubbornness. People use that word like it's a small thing, a child refusing his supper. It is not a small thing. Stubbornness is what's left of a man when everything easier has been burned away. Stubbornness is a man biting down on a leather strap and gripping the frozen earth and refusing, by nothing but the iron of his own will, to flinch the hand that's saving his life. When it was done, when the wound was open and drained and packed and bound with strips of my ruined shirt, he spat out the leather and lay there breathing in long shudders, and I sat back on my heels with his blood freezing on my hands and the bad smell of it in my nose, and I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. I felt useful, not to myself, to another person. There is a particular warmth in that, a warmth that has nothing to do with fire, and it was the first warmth I'd felt all night, and I was grateful for it even there, even then, even with my hands red and shaking. He turned his head and looked at me. And he said something. The first words either of us had spoken in over an hour. I didn't understand them. I never learned in all of it more than a handful of his words, but I understood the tone, the way you understand a tone, and I will go to my own grave certain of what he said. He said, "Thank you." I nodded. My throat had closed up and I couldn't have answered in any case. Now the cold. Because the wound was only half our trouble, and the night was a long way from over, and the snow kept coming down out of that dead-still sky like it meant to bury the both of us in the fire and the whole draw and start the world over clean. The wood ran out around what I'd guess was midnight. The cold came in behind it the way the tide comes in, patient and total. I built the last of the fire as small and as hot as I could, and I knew, watching it, that when it died we would have perhaps an hour, maybe less, before the cold took first him and then me, in whatever order it pleased. I had stopped being able to feel my feet. He had gone quiet and still in a way I didn't like at all. The wound and the surgery had cost him what little he had left, and the cold was moving in on a body too weak to keep it out. I knew what had to happen. I knew it the way you know the few hard, true things, the ones that arrive without any thinking attached to them. Two cold bodies will die apart. Two cold bodies together, sharing what little warmth each has left, each one's living heat slowing the other one's dying, might not. It is the oldest knowledge there is. It is what wolves know, and sheep, and any creature that's survived a hard winter on this earth since the beginning of things. There is no shame in it, and there is no magic to it. It is only arithmetic, the most basic arithmetic of survival, that the heat one body cannot keep, two bodies can hold between them. But I want you to understand what it meant, in that country, in that year, for the two of us in particular. It meant a white cattleman and an Apache warrior, two ends of a war that had taken people from both of us. Two men who that very evening had stood ready to kill each other over a fire, lying down together in the dark, pressed close as brothers, as close as a man lies with his wife, sharing the warmth of their two bodies because it was the only warmth left in all the frozen world. Everything I had been raised to believe said no. Every story I'd been told around every campfire of my life, every hatred I'd inherited and everyone I'd earned, all of it rose up in me and said no, not this, anything but this. You'll die before you do this. And then I looked at him, dying quietly on the cold ground with my shirt wrapped around his ribs and his blood frozen on my hands, and all of it, all that great inherited weight of no simply fell away. Fell off me like the snow off a roof when the thaw comes, because it could not stand up against the simple fact of him, the fact of a man, not a savage, not an enemy, not the far end of a war, a man who had pointed at the ground beside his fire when he could have used his knife. A man who had handed me that knife handle first and bitten down on leather and not made a sound. A man who was cold and hurt and going to die, the same as I was, in the same hole in the same ground under the same indifferent snow. I lay down beside him. I pulled my freezing-soaked coat over the both of us as best it would stretch, and I pressed my body against his and put my arm across him, careful of the wound, and I held on. He stiffened. Of course he did. Every instinct in him fought it same as mine had fought it. For one long, terrible moment I thought he'd push me off, and I braced for it, and I would not have blamed him. Then I felt him let go. Felt the fight go out of him. Felt him understand the same arithmetic I'd understood. Felt him choose, one more time, to set aside everything the world had taught him and trust the man beside him with his life. He turned, slow and careful, and pressed his back against my chest, fitting himself into the shelter of my body the way you'd shelter a candle flame from the wind. And I held him, and our two cold bodies began slowly, to make between them a small warmth that neither one could have made alone. That was it. That was the unusual way. There was no trick to it, no clever Apache secret, no thing I learned that I could sell you in a pamphlet. It was just two enemies who chose to be men instead, lying down together in the dark to keep each other alive, because that is what the cold leaves you at the very end, not the choice of whether to need another person, only the choice of whether you're too proud to. I was not too proud, not anymore. The night had burned that out of me along with everything else. We talked in the dark. I should say we tried to, which was its own kind of talking. I told him my name. I tapped my own chest and said it, Elias, and tapped it again, and he understood, and he tapped his own chest and said a word I could not for the life of me wrap my tongue around, a word with a sound in the middle of it that my mouth was never built to make. I tried it 3 or 4 times and made a worse mess of it each time, and on the 4th try I felt his shoulders shaking, and for one heart-stopping moment I thought the cold had taken him, thought he was seizing, and then I realized. He was laughing. The man was laughing, lying there with a hole in his side and the snow coming down and his life hanging by a thread, listening to a half-frozen white man butcher his name for the 4th time, and he was laughing silently, his whole body shaking with it, and then I was laughing too, the two of us pressed together in the dark, helpless with it, laughing at the end of the world. I have been to fine parties. I have heard music played by people paid good money to play it. I have never heard a finer sound than that man laughing in the dark because I couldn't say his name. When it passed, he was quiet a while, and then he tapped my chest, and he said a word, a different word, short 2 sounds, and tapped my chest again, giving me a name. His name for me, since I'd made such a hash of his and he'd given up on me ever managing it. I never knew exactly what it meant. I have my guesses. I think, and an old man is allowed his guesses, I think it had something to do with the wood, with a man who walks out into a storm and comes back. I have chosen to believe that anyway. It has cost no one anything for me to believe it, and it has warmed me on more than one cold night since. We lay there. The fire died down to coals and then to nothing. The snow kept coming. And against all the arithmetic, against the storm and the wound and the whole indifferent enormous winter, the small warmth between our two bodies held. But I told you there was a hard choice in this, a heavy one, and I have been putting it off, the way you put off the part of a story you don't come out of looking good, and I am too old now to keep putting it off, so here it is. Toward the deepest part of the night, when the cold was at its worst, and the man had gone so still and so quiet against me that I had to press my hand to his chest to feel the slow, far-off beat of his heart and be sure he was still in there. Toward that part of the night, I made a choice. He had a parfleche, a rawhide case, that he kept close all night. I'd noticed it the way you notice things about a man you're forced to lie close to in the dark. And sometime in those small hours, my own body shaking, my own heart slowing, the cold whispering its old patient invitation to just stop, I worked it open with my numb fingers to see if there was anything in it that might burn. Anything at all. Because the fire was dead and I had become certain we would not see the morning without one. Inside was not tinder. Inside, wrapped careful in soft hide, was a small bundle of things. I could not see them well in the dark, I could feel them. A few small carved things. A pouch that smelled of dried herbs, medicine of some kind. And a thing that I knew by feel was a child's, a tiny moccasin, no longer than my thumb, beaded, worn soft. These were the things a man carries that never show up in any ledger. These were his unwritten columns. His dead, maybe, or his living far away, or both. The whole weight of a man's heart, wrapped in soft hide and carried through a war and a wound and a killing storm. And I understood, kneeling over them in the dark with my dead fingers and my slowing heart, that I had two choices. I could close the bundle and put it back and lie down again and likely die before the dawn, the both of us, with his heart kept whole beside him. Or I could burn them, the hide, the pouch, the small carved things, the tiny moccasin, feed every last precious irreplaceable piece of the man's heart into a fire and buy us, maybe, one more hour of warmth, one more hour against the morning. I knelt there in the dark with his whole heart in my two hands, and I made my choice. I'll tell you what I chose next. I closed the bundle. I want to say I did it quickly, that the choice was easy, that the better man in me rose up clean and certain and shut that rawhide case without a second thought. That would be a finer story. It would also be a lie, and I told you at the start I have never trusted a clean story and I won't tell you one now. The truth is I knelt there a long time. The truth is my hand actually moved toward the fire pit with the little carved things in it. The truth is that the cold whispering its old patient invitation had become very persuasive by that hour, and there is a thing that happens to a man's mind when his body is dying. It gets reasonable. It begins to build careful arguments. He'll die anyway. You'll both die. What good are a dead man's keepsakes to a dead man? Burn them and live, and you can carry his memory yourself, which is more than ashes can do. The cold is a fine lawyer. It had me half talked into it. What stopped me was the moccasin. I had it in my hand, that tiny beaded thing no longer than my thumb, and I was holding it over the dead coals, and in the dark I could not see it, but I could feel it. Feel the small, careful beadwork some mother had done by firelight, stitch by stitch, for a foot that small. And I thought of my own. I had a son once who didn't live to be 2, and somewhere in a trunk at the ranch, wrapped in cloth, was a thing of his I have never once been able to make myself burn, though God knows I've been cold enough nights to want to. You do not burn the heart of a man to warm his body. There are some sums that don't come out, no matter how the cold does the arithmetic. A man who buys one more hour of breathing by feeding his only friend's dead child into a fire has not survived the night. He has only arranged to keep walking around afterward, which is a different thing, and a worse one. I put the moccasin back. I put all of it back, the carved things and the medicine pouch and the little shoe, and I wrapped the hide around them careful as he had, and I set the bundle back where he kept it close, and I lay down again and put my arm over him and pressed my dying body to his dying body, and I prepared, with as much peace as I could find, to let the morning come or not come as it would. That was the choice. I have never been sure it was the brave one. It may only have been that I couldn't live with the other. Sometimes that's all that goodness is, when you get right down under it, not a strength, but a thing a man simply cannot make himself do, and calls a virtue afterward to feel better about the gap where his nerves should have been. I closed my eyes. I stopped making lists. I held on to him in the dark and I waited. The storm broke about an hour before dawn. I didn't see it break, because by then I was somewhere down underneath my own consciousness, in a gray warm nowhere that I have since come to understand was a good deal closer to dying than I knew. But I felt it. Even down there I felt it. The snow stopped, and the terrible enormous pressure of it lifted off the world, and into the hollow came a cold so clean and so still and so bright, even before sunup, that it pulled me back up toward the surface of myself like a hand reaching down into water. And there was a sound, a small one, the smallest possible sound. The man was breathing, slow and shallow and ragged with the wound, but breathing. I could feel it under my arm, the slow rise and fall of him, and I lay there feeling it for a long time before I trusted it, before I let myself believe that the two of us had done the impossible arithmetic and come out somehow on the living side of it. We had not frozen. The warmth between our two bodies had held through the worst of the night, just barely, just exactly barely enough, and the storm had broken before the cold could finish what it started. When the sun came up over the lip of the cutbank, it came up on a world made entirely new. Every branch and stone and broken stem sheathed in ice, the whole draw blazing white and blue, and so beautiful it stopped the breath in my chest. And I have never since been able to look at fresh snow and early light without thinking of that morning, and of the man breathing slow beside me, and of how close the both of us had come to never seeing it. He woke a little after the sun did. I felt him stir, felt him come back into himself, felt the moment he remembered where he was and who he was lying against. He went still, that old wary stillness, and then I felt him relax deliberately, choosing it again the way he'd chosen it all night. He sat up slow, holding his side. He looked at the bright new world. He looked at the dead fire. He looked at the bundle, his bundle, sitting exactly where he kept it, untouched. Then he looked at me. I don't know what showed on my face. I was past hiding anything by then. Maybe he saw that I'd opened it. Maybe he saw that I'd closed it. Maybe he saw nothing and simply understood, the way he seemed to understand everything without needing to be shown. He looked at me for a long moment with those deep-set eyes, and the old scar pulled at the corner of his mouth, and he reached over and he put his hand flat on my chest, over my heart, and he held it there. That was all. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I have been thanked many times in my life, with words and with gifts and with handshakes, and not one of them ever reached as deep as that one cold hand laid flat over my heart in the blue morning light. We were 3 more days getting out. I'll spare you most of it. It was hard and it was slow, and the man was weak from the wound, and I was weak from the night, and the country was buried under 2 feet of fresh snow that hid every hole and softened every landmark. We helped each other. There is no other way to say it and no better thing to say about any 2 men. He knew the country and I had the strength in the early days to break trail. And then as the days went on and his fever came down and his wound began, against all odds, to mend, our strengths traded places, and it was him breaking trail while I stumbled behind. We carried each other by turns. We shared what little food there was, a hare he snared, some frozen roots he dug, a thing he found under the bark of a certain tree that I would not have known to look for, and that I have never been able to find again. We did not talk much. We couldn't, but you would be surprised how little 2 men need to talk once they have spent a night keeping each other from freezing to death. We had passed beyond the country where words were necessary. A look did it, a gesture. Once, struggling up a long white slope, I went down to my knees and could not for a moment make myself get up, and he came back down to me and did not say a word, only crouched there beside me in the snow and waited, and put his hand on my shoulder and waited some more, until I found whatever it was I needed to find and got up again. He never made me feel weak for needing it. He had needed me 3 days before. We were keeping accounts that didn't have to be settled, because they would never, either of us understood, be closed. On the 3rd day we came down out of the high country into a long valley, and at the far end of it I could see, small and dark against all that white, the smoke of the town I'd been making for, and the church where they'd have buried my brother-in-law 2 days back without me. We stopped at the edge of the trees. He would not go further. I understood why, and I will not insult him or you by explaining it. A town in that year in that country was not a safe place for a man like him, and the both of us knew it, and there was nothing to be done about it. And so we stopped at the edge of the trees where his world ended and mine began. I didn't know how to say goodbye. There's no list for it. I stood there in the snow groping for something, anything, and I found nothing, and in the end I just held out my hand, the white man's foolish gesture, the only one I had. He looked at my hand, and then, and I think he did it to be kind, I think he did it because he could see I had nothing else, he took it. He shook my hand. Solemn and a little awkward, the both of us, 2 men performing a small strange ritual at the border of 2 worlds that had spent a generation trying to destroy each other. And then he reached into his clothes, to the bundle I knew he kept close, and he took something out of it, and he pressed it into my hand and closed my fingers over it. It was one of the small carved things. I could feel it through my glove. He closed my fingers around it and he held my fist shut in both his hands for a moment, hard, and he looked at me. And he said something, a few words, low, and then he let go. He turned and went back up into the white country, and he did not look back. And I stood there at the edge of the trees and watched him until the trees took him. And then I stood there a while longer watching the place where he'd been. I never saw him again. I want to tell you he was fine. I want to tell you the wound healed clean and he found his people and lived to be old and died warm in his bed, surrounded by children with feet that small. I have told myself that version 1,000 times. It is a good version and I recommend it. But I have lived a long time and I know what that country was, and I know what came after, the years that followed, the campaigns, the reservations, the things that were done. I know the odds. A man does not survive forever in a war he is losing, and he was on the losing side of the worst war this country ever fought against its own. And I have no reason to believe he saw many more winters, and every reason to believe he didn't. That is the bittersweet of it, and I will not pretty it up, because you have stayed with me this far and you've earned the truth. I was given for 3 days and 1 impossible night, the finest friend of my life, a man who pointed at the ground beside his fire when he should have used his knife, who handed me that knife handle first and bit down on leather and didn't cry out, who laughed in the dark because I couldn't say his name, who laid his cold hand flat over my heart in the blue morning light, and I was given him only long enough to lose him. That is how it goes sometimes. The cold gives you exactly 1 person, and then it takes the world back. But I do not think it was a cruelty. I have decided in my old age that it was not a cruelty, because I have it still, the thing he carved. It sits on the shelf by my bed where I can reach it, a small carved bird worn smooth now from 50 years of an old man's thumb, and on the cold nights, and there are a great many cold nights at the end of a life, I take it down and I hold it, and it warms in my hand the way it always has, the way it did that first morning, and I am not somehow alone in the dark. That is the unusual way to stay warm. That is the whole of it, the thing I learned in a hole in the ground in the winter of 1878 and have never once needed to learn again. It is not a fire. A fire burns down. It is not even another body, though God knows that helped that night. It is the other person inside you, the one you carried out of the cold and could never afterward put down, warming you from somewhere a fire can't reach, on every cold night for the rest of your life, long after they themselves have gone wherever the good ones go. I made him a list once in my head in those 3 days walking out. Things I will never be able to repay him for. It was a long list. It was the only honest list I ever made that wasn't too short. I am an old man now, and I have told you the thing I never told anyone. I don't know why it had to be you. Maybe it didn't. Maybe I just got cold enough, finally, that I had to set it down by somebody's fire. The birds in my hand. The lamp's getting low. I find lately that I'm not afraid of the dark the way other old men are, and I think it's because of that one word he said when he pressed the carving into my fist, the few low words I never understood and never will. I've spent 50 years deciding what they meant.